Happy St. Patrick's Day. How are you doing today? I think we could all use a story about courage. And do you know the story of the real St. Patrick? He was a stud. He did so many amazing things, and he was an escaped slave. He survived human trafficking. He was a fierce lover of his enemies. He was amazing. I really think that we're celebrating him all wrong. I didn't know the real story of St. Patrick until recently, and it's so good. I just want to share it with you. So I'm going to read from some historical documents of his life, and hope you enjoy Patrick. He's so cool. Okay, around 400 AD, Patricius Patrick was growing up in what is now northeast England. His people were the Britons, one of the Celtic peoples then populating the British Isles, though Patrick's aristocratic family had gone Roman during the Roman occupation of England. So Patrick culturally was as much Roman as Celtic. His first language was Latin, and he understood some of the Welsh spoken by the lower classes. His family was Christian. His grandfather was a priest. He acquired some Christian teaching, he was baptized, and he knew the catechism, but he became only a very nominal Christian. He actually enjoyed ridiculing the clergy, and in the company of other ungoverned youth, he lived toward the wild side. It's like literally written of him. Crazy, right? Patrick was 16. Okay, this is where things get crazy. Did you know that the story of St. Patrick involves pirates? I told you, we're celebrating this all wrong. When Patrick was 16, a band of Celtic pirates from Ireland invaded his homeland. They captured Patrick and many other young men, forced them onto a ship, sailed to Ireland, and sold them into slavery. The Patricks sold Patrick to a prosperous tribal chief and druid named Maliach, and he put Patrick to work herding cattle. Patrick lived the next 6 years there. He spent blocks of time on the settlement with the other slaves, probably other Britons, and probably some of them were Christians. And they would have welcomed Patrick into their group. He spent other large blocks of time in the wilderness managing a herd of cattle, perhaps assisted by an industrious border collie or Welsh corgi. I would really like to think that there was a little dog with Patrick, wouldn't you? During his 6 years of enslavement in these two settings, Patrick experienced three profound changes. First, in periods when Patrick was herding cattle in the wilderness area, he experienced what theologians call God's natural revelation. He sensed with the seasons, the creatures, the nights under the stars, and the ever-present winds, the presence of God. He identified this presence with the triune God he had learned about as a child. And in more or less his autobiographical confession. Did you know Patrick also wrote a confession? We know about Augustine's, but Patrick, what? Patrick tells us, after I had arrived in Ireland, I found myself pasturing flocks daily, and I prayed a number of times each day. More and more, the love and the fear of God came to me, and my faith grew, and my spirit was exercised until I was praying up to 100 times a day, and at night, nearly as often. Patrick became a devout Christian, and the profound change was obvious to his captors. Second, Patrick changed in another way during the periods he spent with his captors in their settlement. He came to understand the Irish Celtic people and their language and their culture, and with a kind of intuitive insight that's usually possible only from the underside. The people there knew that this slave understood them. Third, Patrick came to love his captors, to identify with them, and to hope for their reconciliation to God. One day, he would feel that they were his people as much as the Britons were. One night, after 6 years of captivity, Patrick had a dream. A voice spoke to him in this dream, announcing the good news of his imminent freedom. The voice instructed him to awaken early and walk to the seacoast. Your ship is ready. He walked for several days, reached the seacoast, saw the promised ship, and negotiated his way on board. What happens next is anybody's guess. 25 years, historians have pieced together little scraps from different places, and so this is what they have collectively. That ship probably took Patrick to Gaul, which is, we know he spent some time there in a monastic community called the St. Martin of Tours. And then he also spent some time in Rome. And eventually he makes his way back to England. Once he's in England, he goes through some training in scriptures and becomes a priest in the parishes of England who served there faithfully for years. And then one night, years later, Patrick has another dream that changes his life again. An angel comes to him in his dream with a letter from his former captor in Ireland. As he's reading one of the letters, Patrick imagined in that moment that he heard the voice of those very people who were near the wood and Foclet, and they cried out with one voice, "We appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk among us." When Patrick awoke the next morning, he interpreted the dream as his Macedonian call to take the gospel to the Celtic people of Ireland. And so he went. Patrick's mission to Ireland was to be such an unprecedented undertaking that it is impossible to overstate its significance or the magnitude of the challenges they faced. Why? Because the Irish Celtic people were barbarians. They were barbarians, and they were feared by many in England at that time. They were the enemies. They were the ones who came and took people captive and enslaved them. They might have had a few Christians there, but as a people, they were considered unreached with no thriving church. Patrick took a very different and controversial approach to the prevailing missionary efforts of the 5th century church. Instead of essentially Romanizing the people and seeking to civilize them with respect to the Roman customs, he actually wanted to see the gospel penetrate to the bottom of Irish culture and produce an indigenous movement. He didn't mean to colonize them, but to truly evangelize them. Get this. At the age when Patrick had that dream, he was 48 years old. He was already past a man's life expectancy in the 5th century. Having known the language and customs from his captivity and having long strategized about how the gospel might come to the Irish, he now answered that call to return to the place of his pain with a message of joy. The slave returned to his captors with the good news of true freedom. Now, here's where things get particularly interesting for us today. Get this, you guys. I was reading this book about Patrick and I came across this paragraph that I literally was like, what? No way. Get this. One of the ways that Patrick attempted to grow the church in Ireland to actually encourage the faith of the Irish believers is this process of isolation. Legit, get this, you guys. Those of us who are in self-containment right now on shelter in place, that's literally one of Patrick's strategies in Ireland was shelter in place. I'm reading this directly from this account. This is what he recorded. Number one, he recommended that his church spend voluntary periods of solitary isolation, ordinarily in a primitive cell, in a remote natural setting, like a grove of trees or a stream, drawing on the wisdom of the church leaders. The Celtic leaders were advised to go and sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. They also spent time with the people that were caring for their souls, the Anam Cara, the soul friend, not a superior, but a peer who you would share your life with. And then get this, you guys, this is so great. The monastic community at that time was really big. But in this practice of spiritual growth, you actually spent time with small groups of 10 or fewer people. What? Okay, so like literally they're in isolation and in groups of 10 or less people. It's St. Patrick's Day today. I cannot get over the irony of this. That's literally what we're doing right now. They shared common life, meals, work, learning, prayers, worship together. We can do all those things over Skype, people. So they grew. And this is what I love. Are you ready for this? Okay. The purpose of this isolation and gathering in groups of 10 or less was to root your consciousness in the scriptures, to help you experience the presence of the triune God, and to fill you with his focus, his power, his compassion, and that would empower you for the mission that God had for you. It's like literally their secret weapon was isolation, staying in groups of 10 or less people. Crazy, right? Interestingly enough, what history tells us is that at the time of Patrick's death, which the reason we celebrate St. Patrick's Day on March 17th is it's believed to be Patrick's day of death, and in what we have of the historical recordings. But get this, soon after his death, the Irish slave trade came to a halt, and other forms of violence, such as murder and intertribal warfare, decreased. And the communities modeled the Christian way of forgiveness, generosity, and peace to all of the Irish. So what did the Irish people think about Patrick? We'll check this out. Okay, let's revisit someone in whom the Irish perceived the authentic sign. Following Patrick's Macedonian call, we can reasonably infer that he re-entered Ireland with the most remarkable ethos of any missionary who ever undertook a frontier mission. Imagine the rumor that would have spread like wildfire across the Irish people's grapevines. Our slave Patrick has returned at great personal risk, loving us and telling us that the high God loves us. Many stories circulated that reflected his compassion and his understanding of the Irish and their instinctive trust in him. One critical incident reflects how contagious the rumors were about Patrick and the profound ethos that his courageous return to Ireland had catalyzed in the people's minds. Patrick resolved early in his mission to return to the region where he once lived as a slave. He planned to pay the bond money for his ransom to Meliach, the man who had bought him as a slave. He's now an old man, and he had wanted to tell him about Jesus Christ, who paid the ransom for Meliach's freedom from sin and death. When Meliach heard that Patrick was en route to see him, he locked himself inside his house and burned it down. Just like when I read those words, I completely lost it. But how beautiful was Patrick's heart? He literally went to pay the money back to the man that purchased him out of slavery. And going back to that period of isolation and gathering in groups of 10 or less people, this is the purpose for that, you guys. Listen to this. This is how the people prepared in Ireland, the whole community prepared to live with depth, compassion, and power. So they isolated themselves and they gathered in groups of 10 or less people to get to know who God is and to live with his depth, his compassion, and his power as they sought to love their enemies and the people who are at that time still enslaving their people. What? So I don't know about you, but I think we need a do-over for St. Patrick's Day. And I think we need to celebrate a little bit differently. But I hope you are encouraged that we are not the first group to be isolated and to be gathering in small groups. We are not the first group of people to face challenges. And maybe we can use our very light captivity in a way that brings us collectively the depth and the compassion and the power of the same God who loved Patrick, who loves the Irish, and who loves us. And may his profound love motivate us in this chapter of history as well. Happy St. Patrick's Day.